Thank you for viewing this YouTube archive of a Conscious Consumer Network broadcast. Please feel free to share it far and wide. Check out our weekly broadcast guide for weekly updates on scheduled broadcasts. Help keep us on the air by contributing to our network support fund. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or get in touch via email. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.
And welcome everyone to UnSpun episode number 120. I'm your host, John Irvin, with my co-host, Joe Atwill. And tonight we have with us Steve Outtrim from Burners Me. And so welcome, Steve.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Joe. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I've been following the work that you have been revealing on Jan's shows at Gnostic Media, and I've just found it fascinating. Would it be okay if I asked you just to give kind of a general overview of what your site is about and the insights that you're, the thrust of where you're trying to take your analysis?
Sure. So I have a background in the tech industry, and particularly the .com days. I had a company called Sausage Software that I took public in 1996, and we had a piece of software called Hot Dog, which people used to make web pages. It was the third most downloaded program on the internet in 1997. And I sold out of that in 2000. I became an investor and invested in more than 50 early stage technology businesses, and sort of laid the foundations for the rest of the century through those investments, and lucky enough to be able to retire again. And the last 3 or 4 years, I've been researching and writing a book looking at the shadow history of Silicon Valley. So, with history, there is an official version of events. His story, it's always written by the victors. And if you look into the murky shadows of history, that's where you can really start to get the nuggets of truth that help you put together the real picture of what happened. And the official version of Silicon Valley is fairly well known, but to me, you can't really look at simply the technology of Silicon Valley. You have to look at the culture, and more specifically the counterculture, which has been artificially manufactured as social engineering. And I discovered that the work of yourself and Jan in manufacturing the Deadhead, and I'd encourage anybody watching this who hasn't read that to have a look. And that's a really great foundation for how the 60s was put together, and there was an agenda behind the counterculture movement. And when you look at the Burning Man today, I have a site called burners.me. It's not affiliated with the Burning Man organization in any way. It's independent. I'm just someone that goes to Burning Man and loves it. I recommend everybody to go. But on my site, burners.me, I have maybe about 1,500 posts exploring all different aspects of Burning Man. And one thing that I've found from really studying this organization in great depth is a remarkable similarity between the burners of today in San Francisco and the hippies of the 60s. And one of the common areas of belief is just, they grow their hair long, they wear bright colors, outrageous costumes, they speak in code and different language, they have free love, and they hug each other. It's all about peace and nonviolence. They genuinely believed that they would, bring a stop to war. That's it, and the whole world would become a better place because they were taking LSD and other suggestogens.
Good job.
This polyamorous behavior, thinking that that's going to make the world a better place. And if you look at how that turned out for the baby boomers and what's happened since the 60s, I really, in some ways, maybe the world is a better place, but there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of war, there's probably more war now than there was in 1968. And so likewise today with the burners, there's a belief amongst some of the people who go to Burning Man, and I think more particularly the younger generation, that they are making the world a better place because they go to Burning Man. And in fact, that they are culturally enlightened and superior to people that haven't made the pilgrimage to Burning Man. Because when they go to Burning Man, they have a transformational experience, and it enables them to become whoever they want. And this is kind of the modern Burning Man of 2016. That's sort of the sales pitch of it is, come here to have this transformational experience. And part of the transformational experience is trauma-based, that you're in a very difficult, harsh environment, you're suffering, you're cut off from your regular family, friends, and outside world, and then you're being very much encouraged to wear a costume, give yourself a different name, be whoever you want to be, play a role, be a character. And, you know,
what if you don't have any problem being yourself or just being who you are and how you usually dress, you know?
Yeah, well, I first went to Burning Man in 1998, and I had an online community of about 2 million people. I just took my company public. I mean, I was very successful and very self-assured, so I never had a transformational experience at Burning Man like this. I had a great time. I met awesome people and made friends and, you know, made an effort to see them away from that environment and develop real friendships with them. So from that sense, it was great, but the whole thing of it was lost on me. And I think actually many of the early burners, you know, I'm 43, but the ones who were going in the 90s and maybe the early 2000s had a great time, maybe didn't have this transformational experience. Whereas the majority of people at Burning Man today have only been going for the last 3 or 4 years. And that's when this stuff is really being, you know, pushed quite heavily in the propaganda.
Now, but let me ask you, how do you reconcile, you know, saying that people should go to it with all of the military and mind control and music manipulation and psychobiology and all of this stuff that we all know is a part of it?
Yeah, look, it's a very fair question. And I think perhaps by way of analogy to answer that, Shakespeare is amazing. And if you read Shakespeare's Messiah, and you realize the typology and that there's hidden messages and that the whole body of work is actually trying to manipulate and guide you in a certain direction, you can still appreciate Shakespeare. And in fact, you can appreciate it in a whole new and deeper way. And I think, you know, being aware that, you know, propaganda is used to control the population of Black Rock City, it doesn't stop you having a great time there. But if you're not aware of it, then you could be led in all kinds of different directions, not just while you're at Burning Man, but while you're connected to the people in this, you know, vast nebulous burner scene.
So what we need is anthropologists there who are studying the weaponized anthropologists and the Burning Man scene. So we're kind of like another layer back, studying all of them and what they're doing. You know?
Yeah, well, if you look at Burning Man's website for yesterday, so that'll be the 16th of May, they just published a story about all the anthropologists they have there studying the burners, and there's 7 different universities. It's funded by the Templeton Foundation.
So that, you know, that's what I mean, though. What about, you know, putting together a group there that's studying all of the anthropologists there?
Yeah, well, that's Gnostic Media, Slaviana.com.
That's our role. Steve, can you tell me what is the drug culture like in Burning Man? Are lots of people taking drugs? Are drugs being given away? Are drugs hard to get? Do you have a sense of any of that?
Yeah, well, so the first thing is that everything's free at Burning Man. There's nothing for sale officially, and things are there in abundance. Like there are many camps where you can go and they'll just give you alcohol for free, or they'll give you a glass and say, here, do a shot of this. You don't even know what it is. Maybe it tastes like Jägermeister. Is there anything else in it? It's sort of difficult to know. And if you watched The Simpsons recently did an episode where they went to Blazing Guy, that was one of the main Simpsons guys is a 20-year burner. And Marge Simpson got accidentally dosed with a hallucinogen and had the time of her life. But that's not cool, you know. And there's elements within the burner culture that are against that. There's other elements that are promoting it. But in the spectrum of drugs, like San Francisco, Northern California is we have medical marijuana, and that's probably a very popular drug of choice at musical festivals. At Burning Man, not so much, because there are hundreds of federal officers, there are sniffer dogs, and it gives off a scent. So it's sort of more skewed towards the spectrum of hallucinogens, of LSD and magic mushrooms in particular, DMT and ayahuasca and the neo-shaman stuff. Some of that was talked about by Al Hubbard in the conversation on LSD video that you guys had on the other day. Right. And then the other, you know, like the Hollywood drugs of the powders and the amphetamines and things like that, I'm sure they're there as well, but it's not really a great environment for it. Sorry about that. Because you know, it's very dusty and very dry, and you know, your nostrils get clogged up with dust within hours of being there. So I did a poll on my website anonymously, and I asked people, had they ever done illegal narcotics at Burning Man? And of the ones who actually had been to Burning Man, 92% said yes to that. So, and even if you were to look at the Burning Man founders themselves and their discussion of it, I think they acknowledge that this is going on. Now, Grover Norquist came recently and he was bragging about it. So it's there, but it's all the type of ones that you guys have been talking about, the Gordon Wasson pantheon of suggestions.
Right. Now, when you think about it in that context, back in the day, you would have the Grateful Dead touring around and stuff. And you could get quite a number of people at a concert, I guess. But what happens is you have these burner communities who then go out and spread the philosophy and the drugs back through the rest of society. So it's kind of the same theme, only now it's at Black Rock.
Steve, how many people are at the event, and how long does it last?
So it lasts now for 8 days officially, but there's 80,000 population of the city. Leading up to the event, the 2 or 3 weeks, there's maybe 10 to 15,000 people there building the camps and everything. There are 70,000 paid participants, and then there's around about 10,000 volunteers and staff. Some estimates as high as 15,000, but it's basically a city of 80,000 people for 8 days. And it's an impressive logistical achievement to create that. In a way, it is like the Dead shows touring around. It's like a Dead show that you can live in for 8 days. But rather than one particular act, there's just stuff going on everywhere. And that's going to the Grateful Dead, I'm glad you brought that up, because you had all the Deadheads that followed the Grateful Dead all over the country constantly, Yeah, and this, like they had their mixtapes, and they had this sort of secondary market of swapping this almost like hacker-like thing of, we're going to tape a concert in high fidelity and then we're going to give that away for free. And they have their marketplace. Was it Shakedown Alley? We didn't really have the Grateful Dead when I grew up, and it's something that I have learned since moving to San Francisco. But yeah, I think you can look at the modern rave scene and see very, very similar elements that the modern rave scene has been modeled on.
Right. One thing that's very different, though, is that, and I saw the Grateful Dead 7 or 8 times back in the day before Jerry died. And one thing that you had was this whole flock of all of these deadheads that literally, when the Grateful Dead went, and left to the next city, you would have this whole caravan of all of these hippies and this whole cult following along, going to the next place, to the next location. And they'd all set up camp. They'd had tents, buses, vans, everything. And it was like this whole mobile community that would follow the Dead around.
Yeah, well, in the case of Burning Man, it's been going for 30 years. It started in 1986, so this will be the 30th anniversary this year. And it's gone through maybe four major phases. So the first phase was down on Baker Beach next to the Presidio military base, and it was at a cult effigy solstice burn. It was at a cult ritual. And then the next phase, when they first moved out to the desert, the former Lovelock Gunnery Range, a Navy missile testing site, from 1990 to about 1995, 1996 was these early artists and pioneers and, pretty heavyweight dudes from the tech industry, and probably a lot of overlap in that early crowd with that Deadhead, the Well type of crowd as well. And then they had a very large satanic ritual in 1996 when they introduced the concept that they would have annual themes. And the first theme they chose was Hellco. It was a very, very elaborate production involving multiple shows in the city of San Francisco, as well as performances at Burning Man. And coincidentally, or as a result of summoning dark energies or that's when they had their first death at Burning Man. So someone was decapitated in a car accident, and then someone also drove a car over a tent and injured 3 people very badly. And so after that, almost like a takeover of Burning Man, and the corporate and management structure that runs it today in 1997, that's when they were sort of established. And one of the first things they did was to establish what they call the regional network. So there are now Burning Man events all over the world, and there's also this like internet-linked group of agents that has said, yeah, we love Burning Man, we support the cause, we want to put on events or help you out or do whatever we can. So they have been trying to expand that and to translate. In 2004, they introduced a thing called 10 Principles, a bit like their 10 Commandments. And that's when the thing really started to become quite overtly cult-like, in my opinion. And they're trying to bring these 10 principles to all of the different regions is a little bit of a challenge for them, because they're running into, the idea of say, in Australia, for example, if you were camping at a festival, you could go to a group of people camped next to you and say hello. It'd be fun. And, if you wanted to be super friendly, take a beer and offer them a beer, but just to go say hello, they'll say hello back. At Burning Man today is more like, oh, no, you can't come here. This is our camp. It's like sort of a little bit of snobby elitism. And then if you went to different places around the world, I think you would find very different cultural boundaries based around engaging with strangers and things like that. And so they've sort of got this vision of globalization, but they're coming up with these anthropological problems. And, I haven't really seen them solve them too well so far.
Wow. Well, you and I had an interesting little issue arise this week. We had somebody who claims to be a former Department of Defense librarian who apparently worked with Colonel Michael Aquino, who we talked about in our Burning Man series, and the ties to the Church of Satan, the Church of Set, the Presidio, etc. This guy filed a false copyright claim against our video, claiming that they were his property, like as if we downloaded his video and then re-uploaded it on our own channel. That's the kind of claim that he filed, not like, we were having an interview or something. I mean, just totally wild stuff. So it's clear that we're getting to them. They want this stuff off the internet.
Yeah, and we're talking about stuff from 30 years ago that's pretty well-established history. Most of it you can go to the Wikipedia pages and read it. I produced a lot of slides from Jim Channon's First Earth Battalion manual. You can buy that on Amazon, So I think that's the great thing about history, is the truth is the truth. And nobody has a particular claim on that. If someone wants to create a work of fiction and an imaginative yarn and say that that's history, perhaps that's stronger, but we're still able to discuss this person's imaginative yarn. So we'll see what happens. And if these type of personal ad hominem attacks continue, and some of this stuff, the guy's just making things up and it's slander. If it continues, we escalate, but it just sounds like another kook. I mean, I thought it was great in our last recorded session, Jan, where you were talking about the hierarchy of trolls. And there's the garden variety Facebook and YouTube comment trolls, all the way up to Harvard and White House trolls. And
exactly.
I think I've had my first run-in with a UFO conference troll.
Right, exactly. So, he would be like a mid-level troll, not quite your high school level, not quite your Harvard level, just, somewhere average in between.
I wanted to just comment on Steve's bringing up the origin and the history. I think that one of the things that is really cutting is that the counterculture is becoming more and more exposed as a government operation. And I think that, like, for example, the Grateful Dead and Ken Kesey, if it becomes essentially common knowledge that their movement was basically part of MK Ultra, say this becomes just a normal way of thinking about things, I think it's really going to point a finger right at Silicon Valley. Because I think if you look at how the personal computer was basically an attachment at the end of the LSD, suggestibility era, I think that could be something that would be very troubling because to government operatives, because then people would essentially just stop believing in the whole system, and then they would be at a point where they would actually be able to defend themselves, because they just wouldn't believe anything. So I think it's really important that the transition from the drug movement of the 60s and the counterculture and into Silicon Valley is documented. I think this is a really, really important area, and I don't think enough has been done about it. And I just want to commend both of you for opening up this this whole discussion about that, and hope that it just continues, because this is something we just have to expose completely and then bring to the public.
Thank you. And I would recommend 2 books. One of them, John Markoff, What the Dormouse Said, which is about a lot of these early tech guys taking LSD. Like you mentioned the PC, you have Steve Jobs, Douglas Engelbart, Alan Kay, Bill English, who came up with the mouse. They're all doing the LSD at Xerox PARC. And then the other book is From Counterculture to Cyberculture by Fred Turner, which is really about Stuart Brand and following the course of that guy. And we find through so much of the history of Silicon Valley, there's Stuart Brand, amazing genius of a guy. But, he makes no secret of being a Pentagon, he was an Army Ranger parachuting into the jungle type of guy, and an incredible tech visionary. And so I think Aldous Huxley as well, I'm not really a fan, not knowing what we sort of know, but you have to admire that the guy who had a brilliant mind. And
well, at least he had an incredible ability to take in a lot of information that was kind of already filtered by him and his team, through rose-colored lenses. But I find the quirks in his personality quite interesting. Like he apparently had a dissociative disorder. He was a psychopath. Had a lot of problems growing up as a child, health problems, etc. Was blind in one eye. But he's just this, the only person you could compare him to would be like a Trotsky, someone who mass murdered like 60 million people,
One area that there's 2 things I'd like to have investigated. And if either of you are able to help with this, I think it would be valuable. One is Stuart Brand's tenure at Fort Dix. This was before he came to San Francisco, which was at the same time that MK Ultra was positioned there. And I would really like to see if there's any whistleblowers or documentation on a relationship between Brand, what he was doing there at Fort Dix during that period. And then the other thing is, Brand came out to San Francisco and took pictures of American Indians for some reason. Mm-hmm. This gave him the inspiration to form an organization called America Needs Indians, which then he says is the basis for his relationship with Kesey, because he said, well, Kesey wrote a book with an Indian in it. I had taken pictures of Indians, so I therefore contacted Kesey, and then the next thing you know, I was on the bus. Yeah, it's not. Literally,
it's like we're at a Pentagon briefing, and I was ordered to go on the bus.
Yeah, this is the story. But I do think it seems to me to be weak, and I really do think it's an area of that could be explored. I think Brand is still alive.
Yeah, no, he's actually in very good health. I'm a member of his Long Now Foundation, and they put on some amazing, fascinating talks in San Francisco. Also, he has his archive down at Stanford. He has 76 linear feet of documentation there.
Oh, God.
One day I'll get into that.
I'd like to have him on the show, so if you guys
it'd be amazing.
Run into him, tell him that we're very anxious to actually talk to him about a few things. But so Brand, essentially took the whole culture into Silicon Valley, and then where it, regenerates around this technology. But as Steve,
in a transhumanism at all?
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, please do. Yeah,
I think sort of more specifically, it was his work with the USCO organization, where he started to experiment with lighting and projectors and strobes and things like that. So if you read the electric Kool-Aid test, that's sort of like he was the tech guy of the Merry Prankster sort of thing. But then he also put on the Trips Festival. So he was sort of a promoter. But I think
so. He was like the Owsley for the lights. Stanley Owsley was doing the speakers. He's doing the lights, and they're engineering all of this stuff
with connections to the Stanford faculty, so I'm sure they have all the latest engineering stuff.
Well, gotcha.
When Brand was at Fort Dix, Owsley Stanley had checked himself into St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is just, this is absolutely hilarious in my mind, because this is just so transparent. he checked himself in for a year and a half, after which he went and joined, I think, the Air Force. I mean, the idea that someone would check himself in for a year and a half.
Yeah, and then also you find Ezra Pound there and L. Ron Hubbard.
Right.
Hospital, right?
St. Elizabeth,
MK Ultra doctors.
yeah, just the ground zero of the MK Ultra experiments. And so, so what you're looking at is these cover stories are weak. Like what in the heck is Owsley Stanley doing in St. Elizabeth when he's 16 years old for a year and a half? I mean, what is he studying? What is training going on? And then you have Kesey's claim that, MK Ultra hired me. That's all I was doing. I was just taking LSD. They hired me. And
Nicole Kidman's dad was also at that same hospital, Dr. Anthony David Kidman, along with Werner Overholzer.
And then, of course, then you have all three of these people coming together. And I have said over and over that the cover stories are weak, but the stories that they come up with to explain their relationships are even worse.
Absolutely. Yeah. We were driving down the freeway and our car broke down. There was traffic on each side. And we just looked over and said, hey, when we formed this band, like right then on the spot, it was just
yeah, exactly.
serendipitous, and I mean, it's just, there's no like history, we did these things and then it's like, yeah, we met overnight and we have some ridiculous story and not much history behind it.
Yeah, that's it. So these stories are very important because they should all be carefully vetted to make sure that the public is aware how weak they are, so that the artificiality of the fact that there is an organization, when you look at for example, the Grateful Dead, and you see all of the secret societies represented in the band, and then you go out one step, you go out to Owsley, to Brand, to Shulgin, to Billy Hitchcock, and then suddenly you see a whole other level, but all these secret societies and banking families, and when you get the whole panoply, then you can see absolutely this is an artificial construction, and then you can start poking holes in how the stories that they come up with, how they got together.
If we could maybe just flick back a little bit to World War II, and you guys, it was a couple of unspuns ago, I think, talking about the Macy conferences and the cybernetics group,
right?
And everything came together then. You had the anthropologists, you had the CIA OSS people, you had the computing cybernetic people, you had the psyops propagandists and the psychiatrists all strategizing this whole thing. And it sort of has evolved out of there. And I don't think it's ever devolved. I think at some sort of strategic operational level, those connections that were there at the Macy conferences have persisted through today. And one thing that I've learned from my research is that during World War II, there was a lot of collaboration between the US and the UK, and particularly on the intelligence side. And this is, we had the Enigma machine, and we had really the first employment of electronic computers being used for military purposes, code breaking, and helping artillery to aim. So coming out of World War II was an agreement between England and the United States to share intelligence and collaborate. And that still exists today. It was called Five Eyes, then it was called Nine Eyes, which is in the latest James Bond movie. I think it's actually 14 Eyes today, which is all the countries that completely share intelligence data through their computer networks. But after World War II, when it was just the US and UK, they called it the Ultra Magic Deals. So I think that's where the Ultra in MK Ultra came from, is that this is the most advanced classified secret project in the world, quite possibly, these computers. And
so it's not actually Mind Control Ultra, it's
well, it is. Ultra was the computing program, the program of computer,
right, but the MK would mean something totally different then, wouldn't it? It would be I don't know, what did you just say? Now I'm forgetting.
it could still be Mind Control. I mean, the one I heard
it could be like Magic MK,
right, exactly. They who knows exactly
Magic, that's what I was thinking. Magic Ultra.
Molech. They say MLK is the abbreviation for Molech. So.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But we mentioned the birth of the personal computer, and that came from the Homebrew Computing Club. And this is where Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, they used to go hang out with all of these nerds. And in Fred Turner's book, he describes how the money to create the Homebrew Computer Club came from Stuart Brand. And it was after an opening of a museum or something in San Francisco, he announced to the crowd that he had this big pile of money, $15,000, $25,000 maybe. And he handed this money out to this crowd of hippies. And he's like, if you need this money, take it and take it away. But if there's something that we could do that's good for the world with this money, give it back and hand it back. And he got most of the money back on the stage from this experiment, the social experiment, and then gave that money to basically create the Homebrew Computer Club. Now, that was at SLAC, which is the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, the Quantum Physics Particle Accelerator. One of SLAC's earliest partners was CERN or Kern in Switzerland, which is also a particle accelerator center. And in the official story of history, that's where the World Wide Web came from. The personal computer came from one linear particle accelerator center. The World Wide Web came from another one. That's a hell of a coincidence. And you know, in fact, when you look at what really happened, there's a lot more to the story than that.
I always wonder when I hear this, because I'm actually familiar with this, I always wonder, well, Stuart got into the personal computer. I mean, whatever happened to America Needs Indians? I mean, I don't know where the Brand was. I mean, America Needs Indians with technology. What Brand seems to just come up with whatever, cover story he's looking for a particular time. And there doesn't seem to be any real natural progression from one, interest to the next.
I don't know. I think you can kind of see a general progression, and maybe this is a little bit of your typology. To Chardin and his vision, his Jesuit vision for a noosphere and one world brain. That's kind of the vision, and the transhumanism and everything like that.
Mega point, right?
But when you look at where did this vision really come from, that's when we're getting into these elite banking families, and really it's an extension of millennia-old vision of how do we control the masses.
Right, and then the Macy Conference is just the application of the vision. I mean, that's really, the vision is there all along. That's the unifying.
And Terence McKenna's time wave zero is to get the Burgoys, the sheeple, to march along to this technocracy, this transhumanism stuff. Yeah,
and that's why what our task is to show the public the millennia-old plan, the idea of the oligarchs having a technological control over the minds of all of the people on the planet, and then to show that from the Macy Conference forward, even I think all the way back to Gregor Lukács and the American Jewish Committee, and then into the Macy, and then on to MK Ultra, that you have individuals with these ideas that are just all connected, all related. They exchange back and forth between the different organizations, and you can actually then, when you come to the conclusion of the Macy Conference, see that they're all ready to go. They're all set. They've got their, and like you said, the Macy Conference was incredible in that it brought together all of these elements, so that when you get to the computing component of the cultural debasement, you can trace that back directly to the same place that produced the cultural debasement of LSD.
Then the electronic music as well, like turning music into electronic music and then using
exactly that's exactly right, because Brand is already experimenting with the effects of these of this kind of music, and so he knows when he combines LSD with it that he's really going to be able to black out the cultural influence.
Combine the LSD, the drugs, the dancing, the music, the lights going with all of this. So, and they're just pulling all of this stuff together to create the ultimate mind control scenario.
It just blacks out the kids' personalities. What was inside of them when they entered into the festival, to the Trips Festival, was one thing. What left was completely another. After the LSD and the music and the dancing, they were changed personalities. I mean,
they had a transformative experience.
It was a transformative experience. Unfortunately, it was it was designed by people who were very sophisticated, and the victims had no idea what they were actually being changed into.
Right. Exactly.
The Golden Gate Park, where Timothy Leary stood up and said, turn on, tune in, drop out, which had been engineered for him by Madison Avenue, Marshall McLuhan. And this thing was promoted as the gathering of the tribes. It's where the two tribes come together. Right. And the two tribes were basically Stanford and Berkeley, the East Bay and Palo Alto. And on the Berkeley, you have Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals. Hillary Clinton's his intern. And they are literally radicalizing these students. There's the Black Panthers, there's the SLA, quite violent stuff that is happening on campuses all across the country. And some people are getting concerned. So the Stanford faction is sort of creating computing and video games and things like that, and computer animation as an alternative to that. Here's a positive path. Don't put your energy into protesting the government in the street violently. Take this LSD and come and be part of the future, and it can be quite a seductive pitch. And then particularly when you get scantily clad, very beautiful, nubile young women handing this stuff out for free. I mean, who wouldn't want to give it a try?
It worked for me. I was there. But it is clear that it's a program, and the victim is simply unaware of it. That is just the trick, is how to get this data, the information that we can tease together and get it into a package that will make people aware of what's happened to them, of how they've been manipulated. So it's a real problem, but I think it's one there's a lot of people working on at the moment.
Well, one thing that's really stuck with me recently from your guys' research was that this concept of damaged goods. It's not, and it's like the teenage allowances. This isn't an accidental choice of words. It's a very, very deliberate choice of words, and that's what they wanted to create, an entire system of goods, because then the children wouldn't have an anchor within a family unit. It would be much easier to get straight into the minds of the kids, and it's replacing the idea that the family is in charge of their children with the idea that state is God. And this is getting back to the ancient concepts,
right? And rebellion is taking drugs.
That's right.
And what's the irony with that is, like, wait a second, so many people are rebelling with drugs now. Isn't that the status quo? I mean, forgive me, but I mean, it's like, if the status quo is all about taking drugs, then doesn't it seem like not doing them is the way to rebel?
Hopefully that'll become the trend. But you can see that what they wanted to do was to, with like their use of the concepts of quantum mechanics, with channeling, they wanted to create the impression that all you needed to do and all you should do would be to turn to drugs and then have an internal experience, and that this somehow would get out into the world and make it a better place. That was a really strong concept from the counterculture, that you just changed yourself and that this would make the world a better place. And obviously, if you are an oligarch, this is just an ideal perspective for the slave to have, because then he's going to rebel by taking even more LSD, So
I could see some threads of Nietzsche in that as well. That it's most people are nothing, but some are Supermen, and so you could be a Superman and just prove yourself. And that when you look at the doctrines and tenets of Satanism, it's the same belief. Like it really is. And in The Usual Suspects, Kaiser Soze says the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing you he didn't exist. And
exactly,
that's what the Satanism was all about. No, we don't worship the devil. That's crazy. That's Judaism.
Hey, we're just having fun. Woohoo!
We're just putting an effigy, doing whatever we want, doing what we will.
That's great. Well, and I was thinking about that earlier, and in fact, Elizabeth had redone a version of Depeche Mode's "Damaged People" that I had originally intended to start play at the end of this, or at the beginning of the show. Maybe I should play that for a minute while we're outroing later.
Sure.
That's a clever idea. But it is true, is that the drugs mask the damage. We have come through this cultural Holocaust. The European has been slaughtered, financially enslaved. I mean, there's just been, from the 30 Years' War through the current PNAC wars in the Middle East, we've just been used as fodder and have been a focus of basically population reduction. And so to give drugs as the way to escape from that reality is just sort of the final straw of the extermination, because now once the drugs and the sophist-based philosophy have been implanted, the individual can never really see his real history, and certainly cannot find an effective way to change his life or to rebel against the system. So, the good news here, gentlemen, is that as long as we are standing and, we have minds, and minds have the capacity to develop reason. And so this is, this has to be, the two principles always have to be to develop reason and to develop congregation, to reestablish the strong bonds that we should have between ourselves that have been taken away, as well as our capacity to think clearly.
Yeah. To go back to the drugs for a second, one point that I wanted to make, and perhaps you can confirm, Joe, because you were probably around in these days, but in the beginning of the 1960s, it seems to me that if you had a sore head, you wouldn't necessarily immediately have an aspirin, right? Yeah, that was sort of a new technology that you could have a pill if you had a sore head. And you look at today, and it's unbelievable pharmacological control of society. And this generation where maybe only 20-30% were rebelling and having the drugs in the 60s, now it's like 90% are probably taking some form of medication, many multiple medications at once. And you say, okay, it's medicine, it's good. There's scientific proof of its efficacy, sure. But you look at, behind the whole push for big pharma, we find the same banking families, and we find the same transhumanism and social control and all of that stuff. And it seems to me that whether it's illegal,
couldn't agree more. I just wanted to mention, I just can't help myself. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say that, psychiatry is just a complete cesspool. I mean, it is an absolute cesspool, and people should not, look to it for anything whatsoever as terms of therapy.
And generally, Joe, just to interject, what most people have that manifest as mental illness are dietary related issues that are further reinforced by the dietary guidelines that the medical industry and American Heart Association, et cetera, are pumping out there. So, we talked about last week about men needing, if they have low testosterone issues, they should start eating more fat and cholesterol, not taking testosterone. And the brain also happens to work on cholesterol. So, it seems that, diet, nutrition should be the first line of defense, just like, with what you were talking about earlier with, with whether it be psychiatry or whether it be medical anything. Start with the most basic things first. Start with your diet and nutrition before you get into, all of these drugs. And when I lived in Yugoslavia, when you got a headache, they gave you Turkish coffee with lemon first, and then if that didn't knock it out, then they would talk about an aspirin.
Yeah, I think it's a whole series of factors, and they're basically looking at the human being and the human mind as the target. And they're like, how can we most effectively target that thing? And by creating the space around it, it's like the psychological concept of Gestalt, that you pick things up because you're immersed in them. An area that Michael Aquino talks about is proxemics. Which is basically the space between people, and that by speaking it very, very closely in front of someone's face, you can really cause them to receive the information in a totally different way. And so in society, we have a lot of artificially created environments, whether it's a shopping mall or it's a school or the movie theater, where we're getting messages overtly, deliberately, consciously, but subconsciously at the same time. And then what's going inside our bodies is all kinds of chemicals, toxic stuff from the environment around us. And then the information that's coming in, that's toxic as well. That is like mostly propaganda. And an amazing thing that happened during the Obama administration is he gave an executive order that they can run propaganda operations against the people of the US. Like, that's incredible to me. I mean, they were doing it anyway, but
yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, now they're just doing it more overtly, but the dummies still don't get it, you know?
Right. Well, I just think that the public is on the cusp of waking up. And what I mean by that is that they're starting to see that there's malfeasance, that the government is not on their side, doesn't have their back, isn't in their interest, but actually is beholden to another organization, and in fact has plans for them that are malevolent. And so what that understanding does and will do is that then the public won't trust big pharma's latest cure for emotional distress, right? Because they'll go, wait a second, you don't really have this you're the same group that gave me LSD. You're the same group that put on the trance dances and with all of that once you start to look into the relationship between big pharma, applied psychiatry, and
Joe,
and the banking cartels.
And Joe, that you just made me think. Do you know, Steve, how many of the big pharma companies are in the Silicon Valley?
No, I don't think there's. I mean, they're probably here. I mean, we have Genentech, which got bought out by Roche, but my understanding is most of them are headquartered in Switzerland, and then sort of New Jersey, and that is a lot of research for these guys.
Interesting. All right. It would have been too easy if they were all centered right there, huh?
Yeah. Well, I will say that if you trace the experimentations that led into a lot of the psychotropic drugs, which are given for personality disorders, like Adderall. Not so much Adderall, but there's a real famous one that just I'm having a memory lapse. But they came from LSD. They're actually molecularly very similar to it, and I think that. This latest generation of drugs, boy, if I was a parent, I would really do a lot of research into the drug, into its history, into the molecular relationships before I let a child have it. I just don't trust them.
If you see someone doing a lot of amphetamines, they have violent psychotic side effects from it. And this Adderall is the same stuff, so we shouldn't be surprised if they have similar side effects. But for me, I grew up in New Zealand and then Australia, and coming to America, one of the most absolutely shocking things was how easily available this stuff is. Like in Australia, it's very difficult to get Ambien, right? Even Viagra is kind of difficult to get in Australia. In America, like you can get on the internet and you can just order anything you want.
My kids went to universities and they've graduated within the last 10 years, and so I have some experience of what goes on in those campuses. And you can get Prozac, meds, Adderalls, anything you want will be prescribed. You go in, you say, I'm having trouble studying, you get Adderall. Say, I'm feeling worried, Prozac. You need to sleep, Sonata. I mean, you can get yourself an entire, drug program legally, and this is for virtually every student. And I was more conversant with the statistics 10 years ago, but it's just shocking, Steve. I mean, you've got over 50% of these of the students are on these really powerful drugs.
The other thing is they mix them together. They mix them with alcohol. It's exponentially getting worse every time you're adding that in.
Exactly. So, it's a cesspool.
And add into all of that with the alcohol and all of the prescription drugs. Today, college kids don't always just smoke cannabis like buds. Now they have concentrated wax that's 3 times stronger, and they're doing dips or whatever they call it, so and you just compound all of this stuff. None of it's even all it's way stronger than hash or anything that anybody had before.
Well, but so there it is. I mean, all of this is a cul-de-sac. It all is. I mean, the toxic chemicals in the food, the drugs that are waiting around every turn, they're always handing them to you. I mean, it all takes the people into a place where they can't think clearly and they can't resist. That's what we're being, exposed to. We just have a very sophisticated system of weaponized anthropology and weaponized psychiatry and weaponized psychopharmacologic, applications. And they all work together as a big, lump to get us to sit there for 10 hours doing, Super Bowl and stare at the TV sets, I mean, the college kids, it's just, the campuses are completely lacking in any kind of spirit of exploration of the, of the control and the malevolence of government. They are it's as if they're in a trance, and yet there's, as to use a phrase, but it's like, as Steve pointed out, the oligarchs are getting bolder and bolder, and the techniques are getting, more and more clear. And so it's really a time to find a way to try to ignite some curiosity and energy for resistance in the campuses, because this is really where any real resistance has to come from. It's from those people, the young ones.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, we have a window of maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years if we're lucky. But the two technologies that are the most concerning to me are artificial intelligence and virtual reality. And there's amazing opportunity in both of those fields as well. But people don't understand that Google, forget the singularity's coming in 20 years. The guy Google pays to create the singularity tells you, don't worry about it, it's 20 years. They have this now. They have all of the sensors in the world. Like each one of us is a sensor. Our iPhone is multiple sensors. So all this data is getting fed in to the largest computer systems that have ever been created. At least 5% of all of the energy in the world goes to the internet. And it's growing, right? This is a beast that's growing. And the concept of is it sentient or not doesn't really matter, because can it be used to manipulate us negatively? Absolutely. And we're seeing that. They're not even hesitating. Facebook just keeps getting busted. It's, it will turn conservative and Donald Trump stories that won't show in the news feeds. And Facebook are doing experiments on people, like trying to alter and measure their state of mind just by what they select to put it in the feed.
The people just have to use. They have to understand the expression weaponized. Everything as is presented to the public is benign. But everything can be weaponized and has been. I mean, anthropology was weaponized, psychiatry was weaponized. And the idea that the internet isn't going to be weaponized is absurd. The population needs to anticipate it, needs to explore how it is weaponized and fight back. I mean, I really do think that as we're having our discussion, we're participating in a real important historical battle, which is the battle for the control over the internet. And that now,
even bigger, the battle for the control of our minds.
Well, because that's ultimately what it is related to. And so what while the internet is still able to be accessed, and it has the capacity for everyone to participate in, we really have to put pedal to the metal and to be very bold and very persistent and try to get the concept of how these different components of weaponized oligarchic control are in play and how we have to organize to resist them. I mean, I think Steve's timeline is very realistic.
And I'd encourage everybody to please download and share these videos, because they are actively trying to censor us. And so far, it's like, here is my opinion about history of the world 30 to 60 years ago. And that is like so shocking they have to censor that. So why don't we get into what's going on today?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and they've been doing it to me for years. I see it all the time. I see all the trolls coming after me and the counterintelligence guys, which we've talked about. And, it's a rampant problem with these guys. So
I have a question, Steve. What do you envision as like an effective kind of network or more organized way of trying to spread information and to, have some resistance? What is, do you have a fantasy? I mean, I know you're someone who understands the technology well. What would you suggest we try to do?
Well, okay, that's a great question. Thanks, Jared. I'll try to answer it in 5 minutes. But going back to what you just said about the big battle, I kind of see the battle that we're in as being objective truth versus a subjective version of truth. And correct me if I'm wrong, but
reality.
All the way back to Plato versus Aristotle, right? And if you want to look at the meaning of a cult being hidden or secret, you know, these spies, vampires, black magician, wizards, whatever, intelligence agencies, everything is based on being in secret. And you expose the vampire to daylight and it instantly disintegrates. And I think what we really need to do is get to truth, objective truth. And if you look at some of the pronouncements recently from Google and Facebook, like, they are angling to be the arbiters of truth in our society. Google is going to tell you what is true and what is false. You know, 9/11 was not a conspiracy. I mean, of course it was a conspiracy. It's people plotting to do a crime. But we can't. That's the big.
What is it? More than two, and it's a conspiracy.
Right, and there's 28 of them or something, but on 19 hijackers.
Obviously, it's a conspiracy, right?
But you know, I think the most important thing that all of us collectively can do as researchers and scholars and students of the truth is stick to this trivium method, because it's provable, it's verifiable, it's documentable. They can attack, you know, whatever they want about us personally, but it's not going to change the truth and the primary documentation. And I think you know, Jan's introduced me to the Brain, which is really a phenomenal piece of software. It's a very, very powerful tool, and I'd love to see, you know, my vision of what could be is one day there would be like a mega brain of all the truth in the world, and areas that people dispute, we can see what's the official story, what's the dispute, you know, where's the documentation.
You know, a couple of years ago, I mentioned to the Brain Company, and I forget who was it. Maybe it was you, Steve, in the recent show, or maybe it was Hans, but talking about creating a timeline software that would show that as well. And I've actually mentioned that to the Brain Company. If there was any way to change this into a timeline, if you could enter dates in there and everything, you know, that would really make it.
It's been amazing in my own research, this concept of a timeline. And I knew Burning Man started in 1986, but I didn't really understand all the other things that started at exactly the same time and just a little bit before it, and then the same people and how they're all tied up. So it's a very, very useful tool, particularly because generally in looking at history, like perhaps one researcher does MK Ultra, one researcher does Frankfurt School, one does Marxism, whatever, but these people aren't really doing that much crossing over of different disciplines. And that's, you know, if you look through your Brain database, there's many different areas and categories there. It's hard to be an expert in any one, but you can't argue with the primary documentation.
Right.
We need an alternative history. A history that is, you know, basically one that is related to the facts, and it is not, you know, designed as propaganda. It's sort of like all of these events, I mean, just going back, you know, just as far as we can basically trace, I mean, there should be a way for an average person to come into, you know, an intellectual structure where they can move through all of these events and see the banking family's relationships, the oligarchic weaponized anthropology, the different ideas about, you know, why does World War I occur? I mean, something that would really, you know, kind of separate out the propaganda from just the events. And then, as Jan said, I think that's a fantastic idea of having the brain basically have a dimension, not just be, you know, X, Y, but also looking back in time, so that as you went through this process, you could also see all these connections as they move forward. It would give people
it would be, well, Joe, just like think of all the things that I started listing that happened in 1979. You had the creation of the word entheogen, Albert Hoffman's book coming out. You had John D. Marx's book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. You had all of these different aspects of MK Ultra shifting in 1979. So, you know, if we could lay all of this stuff out on a timeline, it would revolutionize, you know, what we're looking at and attempting to do. I mean, the Brain Software Company, they thought it was a pretty outlandish idea, but you know.
Well, it'd be complicated
to
do it, but have a visual representation of basically oligarchs, weaponized anthropology, and then weaponized technology, and then just to have ability to go through history. And you know, it isn't just the conspiracy side of it. but it's also just to understand the relationships that exist so that someone can go through history and can see relationships like between the 30 Years' War and World War I, and just get a sense of where we've come from. Because, it's like in the damaged goods show we did, I just talk about this enormous psychic legacy of the destruction of our culture that has gone on for the last 200 years, and we don't really have the points of reference to be able to discuss it, and I think we need that, and sort of to be able to know where we are in the process of all this, so that we can resist.
Yeah, and these skills of critical thinking, teach them to young people today while we still can, because they're soon going to get their cell phone, put it on their third eye, and get lost in that virtual reality matrix world, and full of chemicals.
That's exactly what I see about to happen if we don't get them the trivium. So I agree with you, Steve.
So Steve, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed it. Wanted to meet you for a long time, and I just want to just thank you for your work, and just hope that you have blue skies, brother, because it'd be great to have you have an enormous influence on culture over the next 20 years.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. It's
for awakening people, not pushing them down, though. Yeah, sorry, Steve. Go ahead.
Well, that's for a change, yeah.
Look, I'll come back anytime you guys want me.
Oh, good. Right. I hope so. Anyway, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone. Gnosticmedia.com, postflaviana.org, and burners.me.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning into CCN. This unique network is dedicated to free and independent media. CCN was created with the belief that information is the common heritage of all beings, which is why our live stream high-definition broadcast is easily accessible and free to view. If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Having produced over 1,000 shows in 2015, which are all archived on YouTube, we look forward to bringing you more groundbreaking, cutting-edge information in 2016. For more information on what is on, please check out our broadcast guide for weekly updates. CCN broadcasts in multiple languages and features some key voices of our challenging times who are all in pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world. CCN belongs to you, the people, and it is up to you all to keep this network on the air. Please contribute to the Network Support Fund or visit the CCN shop. We thank you all for supporting free and independent media.